Now the question that's before us right now is very difficult, and it's the problem of evil. And as the professor of philosophy John Hick often says, this is perhaps one of the most difficult subject matters that any believer in God has to wrestle with. And fundamentally, when we're asking, why is there so much pain, hurt, and sorrow, this, in a sense, places a big question mark on whether or not such a being exists. Why? Because God is so understood to be an all-loving, all-powerful God. And so the objection in terms of those that think that evil calls into question God's existence, imagine that if God were all-loving, of course he doesn't want his creation to suffer and hurt. And on the other hand, if he's all-powerful, then he has the means and the ability by which to arrange the world so that this is in fact not happening. Now, I suspect that there are different vantage points one can make of this. First of all, there is no inherent contradiction in the idea of there being such a God and the fact of evil. And that's because philosophers of religion have come to appreciate and recognize that it's possible to have, for God to have, sort of morally sufficient reasons for permitting some aspects of suffering and pain. Now, I have to say that suffering and pain and sorrow obviously affect us psychologically, so that doesn't go away. What we're talking about, or what I'm talking about right now, is the intellectual obstacle that tends to come with this particular question. And let me just then give you the other angle on this. Sure, the two, God's existence and evil, are not inherently incompatible, fine. But what about the amount of evil? Why is there so much of this suffering? And we have a lot of people who chronicle this. Right now, it seems like world events are, of course, catapulted to the forefront. We have issues with Gaddafi right now and his regime, and he's essentially declared war on his own people. Thousands are dying. We have uprisings locally here, though not as drastic, could just as easily turn violent. So we're wondering all of the time, where is God in all of this? And let me just say from the intellectual vantage point, and I suspect my colleagues here will follow up, from the intellectual vantage point, only if you assume that the whole reason of our physical existence is just pure, unbridled happiness, would one come to think that evil poses such an obstacle. You see, in the Christian worldview, most of us who are theists of one of the major so-called Abrahamic faiths suspect that this world is but a trial period. It's to graft us towards sanctification. That is, it's this molding of us to be sort of sons and daughters of God. And that this life is not what the Latins used to call the summum bonum. This isn't the all good of supreme good. What we as Christians look forward to is a day of resurrection, of a day of hope when Christ returns, and then all at that point is made perfect. But right now, there's a certain amount of evil and pain and suffering that ensues for a variety of reasons. And I can't speak to every context. There are scenarios where I simply do scratch my head when I watch world events and go, why is this happening? This just seems to be atrocious. But the bigger picture is that how do we know that, first of all, had God not permitted those evils, would there be fewer people who would be grafted to be sons and daughters of God? Or, or perhaps sometimes the unfolding of that purpose occurs before my very eyes, where I have seen people in situations and scenarios that they develop cancer or whatever the case may be, but as a result, families are brought together. People seek God. They feel for Him, and then they eventually find Him. So I think that as long as we look at the bigger picture and appreciate, on the one hand, despite the fact this is an extremely psychologically difficult issue, from an intellectual vantage point, I'm convinced that the problem of evil at the end of the day is not an insuperable problem for belief in God. But it does give us pause to think about, what can I do amidst evil? And therein lies the province of the counselor or the pastor. They come in, they counsel, and they console you. The promise of God is that He will see you through the difficult times. Not that you're going to be specially exempt from suffering or evil, but that God will be there to carry you through it. But as an objection to God's existence, I don't think that there's any reason to think that therefore God does not exist simply because of evil.
I'd like to read a parable. This is from a book called Straightforward by Larry. This is what it says. Again, it's just a parable, but I think it lends a little bit to what the question is. It says, at the end of time, billions of people are scattered on the great plain before God's throne. Some of the groups near the front talked heatedly, not with cringing shame, but belligerence. How can God judge us? What a ripoff. How can He know anything about suffering? Snapped a cynical brunette. She jerked back the sleeve to reveal a tattooed number from a Nazi concentration camp. We endure terror, beatings, torture, and death. And in another group, a black man lowered his collar. What about this, he demanded, showing an ugly rope burn, lynched for no crime except being black. We have suffocated in slave ships. We have been wrenched from loved ones, toiled until only death gave us relief. Far out above the plain were hundreds of such minorities. Each had a complaint of God for the evil and suffering God permitted in the world. How privileged God was to live in heaven where there's no oppression. All there was sweetness and light. No weeping, no fear, no hunger, no hatred. Indeed, what did God know about the hassles man had in the world? So each of these oppressed minorities sent out a leader chosen because he had suffered the most. There was a Jew, a black, an untouchable from India, an illegitimate son, a POW, an American Indian, and one from a Siberian slave camp. In the center of the plain, they consulted with each other. At last, they were ready to present their case. It was rather simple. Before God would be qualified to be their judge, He must endure what they endured. Their decision is that God should be sentenced to life on earth as a man. But because He was God, they set certain safeguards to be sure that He did not use His divine powers to help Himself. First, let Him be born a minority, a Jew. Let the legitimacy of His birth be doubted, so that many will question who His father really is. Let Him champion a cause so just, so radical, that it brings down upon Him the hate and condemnation and illuminating efforts of the establishment of every major traditional and established religious authority. Let Him be the object of put-downs, ridicules. Let Him be spat upon and labeled crazy. Let Him be betrayed by His dearest friends. Let Him be indicted on false charges, tried before a prejudiced jury, and convicted by a cowardly judge. Let Him experience what it is to be terribly alone and abandoned by every living thing. Let Him be tortured, and then let Him die. Let Him die the most humiliating death. And let His name live on, so that for centuries His name will be used as a common curse word in moments of rage. As each leader stepped forward and announced his prison sentence, loud approval went up from the great throng of people. When the last had finished pronouncing the sentence, there was a long silence. No one uttered another word. No one moved, for suddenly they all knew that God had already served His sentence. And because He has, He now deserves to reign and rule over all. The comment that I could come alongside of that is to say that when we talk about pain and suffering and evil and hurt, please understand that our God joins in with that. He is not aloof and distant and doesn't fear that. He doesn't stand at a distance and say, well, that's too bad, you're on your own. He joins in with that. And the death that Jesus died and the suffering that Christ went through and the way that He humbled Himself, God understands our pain and our hurt, and He joins in with that.
The only thing I would add is I think the challenge oftentimes is there's one approach from an intellectual perspective to this question, and then sometimes it's a real personal issue that we're struggling through. When the pain is ours, when we've walked through something difficult, something challenging, something that has deeply scarred us, sometimes the reaction we have is, God, how could you have allowed this to happen in my life. And really there's two ways to respond. One is to allow the circumstance or the situation, as real and palpable as that pain is, to push us away from God, or to allow that situation, that circumstance, that pain to be used to draw us near to God. C.S. Lewis said, pain is God's megaphone to the world. And really, the choice is ours. And what we find when we come to God and when we're honest with Him. And, you know, as we are here tonight to handle intellectual questions, we want to be real with you. You know, none of us are perfect. We all have our challenges, our difficulties. We all carry pain in our life. And what we have found as we've come to God is we've allowed our pain to be used not to push us away from God, but to be used to draw us near to Him, as we have found comfort and peace at the foot of the cross. And we've allowed God to wrap His arms not only around our lives, but to even navigate us through our pain so that we can experience wholeness and healing and hope, which really is something only He can believe or He can bring. And I think ultimately we have to be at a place where we trust Him for that. So I think there's a personal, subjective side to the answer to that question. But C.S. Lewis was so right. God often uses pain in our life to draw us near to Him.